two FBI agents assigned to the same cases for different reasons.
No explainable cause of death.
Do you have a theory?
You believe in the existence of extraterrestrials.
One a skeptic, one a believer, both trying to answer questions that were never meant to be uncovered.
I think those kids have been abducted.
By who?
By what? Seal this up. Nobody sees or touches this.
Distinguishing features indicate subject is not human. You've got to trust me.
I gotta know what they're protecting.
Hold it right there.
Between reality and fantasy,
You've got to protect me.
terror and reason,
Mulder, what are they?
trust and betrayal,
The X-rays and pictures.
lie the chilling secrets
Mulder, is that you? Mulder?
of the X-Files.
Agent Mulder, what are his thoughts?
Agent Mulder believes we are not alone.
The X-Files, a new dramatic series premiering Friday, September 10th on Fox.
FBI profiler Frank Black
He severed her head.
has a terrifying gift.
You can't stop it.
He can see into the mind
What killed this man was anything but natural.
of serial killers. From the creator of The X-Files
Tell me how you know.
I see what the killer sees.
comes one of the most chillingly twisted series ever on television.
It's my gift. It's my curse.
Millennium. Weekdays on Chiller.
It's a jacked up review show. It's a jacked up review show. Jacked up review show. It's a jacked up review show. It's a jacked up review show. Jacked up review show.
So yeah, I faithfully watched the entire X-Files series when it was airing on TV. And aside from what was it, the last couple seasons or so where Mulder wasn't really in it, I really loved that series. It did kind of, in my opinion, run out of steam a little bit. But yeah, it was one of my favorite shows at the time. I think like a lot of people, the chemistry between Mulder and Scully was the big selling point. But I also just like the episodes were a lot of fun, and there was like a great, overarching mythology to that series. As far as Millennium, I got into that. It was actually on reruns on FX, I think. And the series had already ended by the time I discovered it. But that has one of my favorite actors, Lance Henriksen, as the lead. And I feel like, I really wish Millennium had a longer run. It was just so bizarre and creepy. I think season 2 is definitely the peak of that series, in my opinion.
Stellar. You heard it from Erica Wright herself, everyone.
I guess I'd also add that one thing that was interesting with Millennium is just how the tone shifted. Like the first season was pretty much police procedural, focus on criminal profiling. And then in season 2, they started introducing these supernatural elements. The protagonist, Frank Black, became more like overtly psychic rather than just being a behavioral scientist or criminal profiler. But the weirdness that started to show up in season 2 is what made it really engaging for me personally.
1000%. Here from the corners of everywhere around the globe, we got the Trust No One podcast commentators. John.
Hi.
Hi. Dan.
Hi there.
All right. Andrea.
Hello.
Annie.
Hiya.
And Brad.
How you doing?
For sure. So, welcome all. So, we're just going to detail the very mystical, mysterious conjuring that is the X-Files universe. original show was on again, off again for 10 years. It was followed by its spin-off, Millennium, which ran for 3 years, and the additional spin-off, The Lone Gunmen, for 1 year.
If you haven't seen The Lone Gunmen,
You three, you're heroes.
you're missing what the LA Times calls potentially the funniest series in prime time.
Sam Spade, James Bond, Philip Marlowe's secret agent lover.
It's a microchip of the old X-Files.
One smooth operator working undercover.
This is Walter Bacon Skinner. Bingo.
An all-new Lone Gunmen at 9/8 Central Fox Friday.
It's had many books and comics, 2 movies. Thank you all for joining us. Let's just kind of just sample around here how we got into this complex show. Who wants to go first?
Who wants to start?
Come on, don't be shy, guys. We're all talking about just a fun show.
Go ahead, Andrea.
Okay, all right, I'll start. So how did I get into the show? Is that the question?
Yeah. Why is this addicting for so many people? They had to set their VCRs back in the day, or collect the DVDs if they were the second generation.
I just was interested in the content, and I also think just that it was really, really different from a lot of other stuff that was on at the time. And as you started to actually watch the episodes and get into it, I think the whole Scully effect was something that attracted a lot of females to the character and in turn to the show. It was different, and I was not the average kid. I was different. So I think in some ways that was a way that I could kind of connect with something that was a little, beyond the average. So
true.
That's where I came in from. So
Absolutely. Okay, Annie, how about yourself?
Yeah, so I guess I came at it from the obsessive kind of UFO nut angle, in terms of I was massively into the supernatural, and I used to go down the library and take out every single book that they had on anything paranormal. And so that was what I feasted on, and that's what I wrote short stories on when I was a kid. And I would read everything horror. I was reading Stephen King, I was reading, The World. And so when a show came out that was actually exploring some of those amazing kind of Fortean experiences and supernatural worlds, I was straight away on that. And so I came for the paranormal, and I stayed for, I guess, the dynamic between the two of them, but also just to see, the way that gender roles were being explored and overturned, and basically all the challenges that they came up against as believers in different things. With each other, the conflict was great, but with the world and with society and with the government and with everything else. And, when you're a teenager, all you want to do is kind of challenge authority and take over the world and make it better, right? And I guess that's what I fell in love with the show for.
Stellar.
I love it. I love that you said I came for the paranormal and stayed for everything else.
That's how it is.
I love it.
Fair enough. I'll definitely get into that. That's a great talking point. All right, Brad, when did you decide to make time for this?
I'm one of the older ones in the group, so I discovered this in my uni years. So it began running in the 90s, and I was at uni in that time. And I'm like everyone else. I had an interest in the paranormal and interest in aliens and cryptids and, ancient civilizations and, all that, Atlantis and all that stuff. So this was right in the same vein of what I was interested in. And then the kind of, we've talked about this in one of our first episodes, the anchoring of the story within modern day at that time was very appealing to me. It wasn't futuristic. It was easy to access, kind of like the characters and the situations that they were in. It was easy to kind of identify with that. The characters weren't all that much older than I was. So it appealed in that way. And I also really appreciated, and I know we talked about this as well, that they were presenting a female character in a strong, capable way. And if you're someone from the 90s, this was second wave feminism. And, there was a push to be more balanced between the genders. And I was raised with those kind of ideas, and having a strong female character of, you know, and they aren't, one isn't the lead, one isn't the sidekick. They're two strong leads, was very appealing. So that's what kept me kind of coming back.
1000%. Okay. Very, again, just digging these points, guys. This is pretty much, you know, the nail on the head. These are just, is pretty much summing up why a lot of people have often said, and it's still true. And so, Dan, when did you decide to form a podcast about this show after years of enjoyment of it?
Caught like the first screening of the first episode back in the 90s, the pilot, and basically was hooked from that point on. Years later created like the X-Files wiki, which is a website that's still online and people use it. And also like years later, started a Star Trek podcast. And I just thought like having an interest in and the passion for, and you know, a fandom of the X-Files too, I thought, well, it might be interesting to create a podcast about the X-Files as well.
Stellar, very stellar. Okay, John, next up.
Well, I'm the odd duck out. I didn't watch the show when it was originally on, even though.
But I take it you heard of it, you know. People
Oh, well, of course, and you know, I knew it was out there. But you know, I was in college at the time as well, and you know, was busy doing college things and just didn't get around to watching it. It was a show that I'd always wanted to watch, and of course I knew about it. It was in the zeitgeist and everybody was talking about it, especially friends of mine, because I hung out with, you know, people that were fans of Star Trek and Twilight Zone and those kinds of shows. And so it just slipped by me. So when Dan approached me about doing the podcast, he said, well, you know, this will be good because this will be somebody that's coming in who has not seen the show, and you'll give a different perspective perhaps. And so it's been a lot of fun. It's frustrating. I would love to just burn through all of them so that I would know what everybody's talking about at times, but I think it's fun for everybody because I'll be like, ooh, I hope that character comes back one day. And they'll be like, ha, 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 ha. Well, you'll see.
May not be a little antagonizing.
Yeah, it totally is to some extreme. I got into this basically around the 2000s. I was just always watching older programs in addition to some of the new stuff. I was just always kind of just a greatest hits of any generation. And, you know, by this time we had plenty of other just very strong, you know, feminist icons. You know, we had, you know, Detective Benson on SVU, we got A Closer and all those other shows. But yeah, this show was interesting to me because like it did kind of make me fall more in love with just how to convey a tone, how to get a mystery tone, and then change up the genre. Like it's like you can be anything every episode, kind of like the Twilight Zone. And then it did kind of have that Star Trek serialized appeal. And you know, at this time, you know, it's like we had some other hard hitting kind of shows. Like people were probably watching shows like Homicide or, you know, NYPD Blue at this time. But this one was kind of interesting because like it was a year after they had experimented with other kinds of bizarre, like sci-fi fantasy horror mashups like Twin Peaks. And you know, I think by the time Americans saw stuff like maybe Prime Suspect, which changed you know, how you could show a strong, you know, British female lead, you know, but most of us, you know, in the States, we got that maybe a year later on PBS, you know. So it was interesting, is like was again, you know, these two unknowns were just very good at just, you know, you have one who's a skeptic and another who's just total UFO head. And it was just interesting how everyone kind of came into it for different reasons. Because like you say, is like you'd see people who were obsessed with kind of sci-fi conspiracy stuff, and then there were other people who wanted to kind of see, well, there's a monster of the week, or there's a supernatural serial killer going around terrorizing people. So it was like you never know what you're in for. And so I saw like the best of all eras, just growing up. I just would always see part of it. And my intro to it you guys are going to probably laugh at this. Kevin J. Anderson, who had done some very good Star Wars book, was at late 90s, early 2000s. He was writing a bunch of spin-off novels for this. And so I would always see those on the bookshelf. So that was a bit of an intro. You didn't just see it at the DVD stores or, and Dark Horse Comics did a bunch of these comics on it. So it was always interesting. It was everywhere. And it's just so funny because just about everyone got into it at some point, even if they were more of a, say, maybe bigger on Millennium or bigger on just other similar shows. It's just interesting how it's like everyone had encountered it at some point and had their pros and cons with it. So it's like, it's unavoidable. And it stank because I had some friends who just could never get into it. And I never knew why, because it seemed like it was up their alley. And I didn't know if they just saw a lesser season or a lesser episode, or their attention span was just compromised. I don't know. It's interesting when you get into that area and you don't know why people like or dislike what they like, and you just kind of go on to the next conversation. You're like, well, this was weird enough for me that, I was already into kind of stuff like, Matrix. And so I had read some of William Gibson growing up. So when I saw that he had, kind of like Andrea's point on Stephen King is like, there's a lot of authors that dedicate work to this show in some capacity. So it was interesting how there's some kind of springing point you could use, latch onto this one loose way or another. So it's like, there's kind of like how Dan has also summed up, this is a show for everyone, but you just kind of got to pick and choose.
Well, it was a buddy drama, right? So it presented it with equals, not superior, inferior kind of dynamic. It was equals. And because they were representing different kind of not extremes, but different ends of a spectrum in a lot of different contexts. We had the, believer in aliens and the supernatural. And then you had someone who's more pedantic, more, professional, following rules, a bit more of a spiritual person. And then you watched how that relationship between them developed. So I think for a lot of people, that was appealing to see a partnership, right? Where both people could be equally strong. And it wasn't always just action, go, 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 which is, serialized cop dramas, right? Where you introduce new characters and you watch how they take them down, and it's all really exciting. But this was something different, where you saw the characters grow with each other over a course of a season or two, or in this case, many.
1,000%. And it wasn't uncommon that when you saw a new sci-fi or horror show on TV, almost everyone would do the whole, this is the next X-Files. It's like, it just was regenerating this whole subgenre. And, prior to this, a few movies and shows that were cited as kind of influences were stuff like, Alien Nation and The Hidden. And so it was just so funny how, by the time this show was really, really getting big, you had just so many other just kind of supernatural mysteries that were coming out also, that it's like they wanted to kind of pay tribute to it or be the rival show. It's like, are you going to take down the X-Files this fall? And I mean, it helped that I had also seen, growing up, Men in Black. So it's like, I was used to the whole, just everyone makes fun of the guys in shades who don't talk or question their government. And it's just interesting how, much like even George Romero, they're bringing in some social commentary, and then they're, either working your case, or if they're not, then they're just got something just unusual is happening, and you're just gonna have to go along for, like you say, the ride. But yeah, it was definitely before where everyone's attention span kind of changed and everything had to be more like slow burn or just like very direct. And it's, even when it fell out of like popularity for a bit there, I was always kind of just thinking about it. It was very influential, and I would always, much like Star Trek, I would light up when I saw like one of the famous actors in another giant role in another movie or show. I was like, okay, interesting. Nice to know they're still, being approached for some kind of similar kind of role.
Yeah.
Well, and I think to jump on what Dan and Brad had mentioned earlier, that there really was something for everyone on the show, not only from the story aspect, but because of those two characters, different segments of the audience could relate to either of those characters. So it was really smart on their part to have
real character piece. And
That's
even,
right. So
even the guest characters you're going to remember. You're just like, yeah, whatever happened to that weird deformed creature? I want to know what happened to him. I want to know what happened to the other.
But you have the fans of Scully and you have the fans of Mulder, and different personalities of the viewers. They could relate to different characters, and so it brought in twice as many people as it would have if it was just a straight shot.
The friendship is the star.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think as they developed the characters to be just humans, to show more emotion in different situations, I think that really allowed for the audiences to connect with those characters. And whether you loved, the whole shipper aspect of it or you hated it, I think that also brought a different dynamic as you went through the series as well. So they kept it fresh, I think, throughout the entire series. And, had they not done that, I think it may have gone in a different direction and probably wouldn't have been as successful as it was. And those two actors did an amazing job portraying those emotions and making you feel it and making it very, very genuine.
And they have great chemistry. They have great chemistry on the screen. So you could really get into that relationship between them, that little, the kind of constant jibes at each other and, making fun of, oh, you never believe anything, or, oh, well, you believe everything. And so it was a great dynamic between the two of them, not only the writing, but, you have to have that chemistry with the actors. And they certainly had that. And so there was a huge amount of palpable appeal behind that.
Totally.
But what made it culturally, what made it powerful in that moment was because they cast people that were not too old. They weren't established adults. They were still in their 20s, which is still that kind of era when you're questioning and wondering and trying to fit in society. And both of them were in semi-positions of authority, but yet they were junior, right? So they were both in their professional lives making kind of steps forward progress. And that's exactly what many people in the world at that, who the audience became, that's the same journey they were on. So it appealed to them. It appealed to them because they could access the characters, they could access the relationship, they could access the situations in which the characters found themselves in, i.e., their movement as young adults into a world of work or into a world of strangeness or whatever. And people kind of got a little bit of the escapism, while a lot of the realism that they could kind of connect with. There were so many things that made it relevant. Not the least of which was a strong female character, because that's what, really hadn't come before and was
really lacking in this genre. Usually, the gal was the damsel, or the guy was the poorly developed, hunter, who goes and fights the creature or has all the answers, but it's not well earned. And so, it was like you've got all these just complexities that you get to encounter each episode, in addition to the case of the week. And
they were flawed characters.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So not only were they, they weren't the stereotypical male or female characters of the time, right? And they weren't heroic characters, the shining knight kind of characters.
Yeah.
They were
half
flawed.
The time they don't have their guns or anything to take on.
So there was a lot of things that made them accessible as characters for the audience.
And they weren't established actors, so the audience could go on this journey with them and discover who they were, because we didn't have any kind of preconceived notion of them as actors on what they had played before. So, they really lucked out with two just great actors that were able to play off of that.
I think something else that probably resonated with a portion of the viewership, and I know for me at the time, being 13 years old and a female, to see somebody that was not the tall, statuesque blonde in the role of the female lead.
Yeah.
So refreshing to see somebody my height, which is about 5'2", be big, and to me that meant a lot to a middle school girl. That most middle schoolers don't feel great about themselves, and it was like, wow, look at
Right?
this. I know for me, being
middle
13,
school, it's rough because you're having to do what the adults tell you, and then you got all this peer pressure from what's the current predicament, and so it's like basically this show is like anything and everything, and so you become invited because you don't feel closed off from the group,
Yes, it very much kind of sucked you in. It was like, hey, she's like me. She's short. And I know they put her on an apple box sometimes because the height difference was so different between the two of them. I get that. I have to climb cabinets to get stuff at the house.
I would always hear stories about that growing up. People would be at fan conventions and be like, yeah, so-and-so. They're always
But I'll give Chris Carter a ton of credit for fighting to cast Gillian Anderson, because damn, would this show have been different without Gillian Anderson.
Oh yeah, and
it seems to me that sort of before the advent of the X-Files, you didn't have as many sort of multi, big franchises. Like I was thinking about, well, you had like Star Trek: The Next Generation, which was just before the X-Files started, basically. Then you had like the likes of The Matrix, so I was thinking about the Animatrix.
The Highlander show was big at this time. It was constantly being syndicated. So everyone's used to
sort of all preceding even like Star Wars with the prequels, and of course the massive Marvel stuff nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, X-Men would come out at like the end of the 2000s, but it made me even wonder if movies or shows like that would have been made had something as mysterious and welcoming as this had come out, because it's like you would see plenty of other giant special effects pieces, and half of them were rendered mute because again they had ideas, but they weren't meticulous about how they would have a fun premise that would challenge a viewer, or again, just they would be like the worst X-Files episode. You still remember the worst X-Files episode because basically you had something to grasp onto, compared to say the worst movie where you're like, man, that's a mess. And so it was just interesting how it's just so many people are latching onto it and being influenced by it. And
it's sort of like not only the creation of spin-offs, but like I really liked there were occasional like crossovers between the spin-offs.
As the Millennium nears,
He was dead, then somehow he wasn't.
only one man
Frank Black?
can stop the coming apocalypse.
The Millennium Group believed that time was upon us.
Lance Henriksen guest stars.
Look out!
The X-Files, an all-new episode, Sunday at 9, 8 Central on Fox.
You know them from the X-Files. Now, the lone gunmen are stepping out on their own.
Full body cavity search.
Their missions aren't impossible. They just make them look that way.
I gotta say, so far this job sucks.
The Lone Gunmen, coming this March to Fox.
it was gentle. It was never interfering with the other. It was kind of just a week to week, hey, what we didn't do on that show, we're going to do on the other show if you stay tuned. And then it's like, I love it when they do that with spinoffs, because like nowadays they will kind of force spinoffs on people and you're like, that's too much of a good thing. You know, and it's like, this was just very calculated, and they played all their cards right, because it's just like, we don't know how long we're going to be on here and how long we can keep the story going. So let's just,
but
let's
like in the
keep
case
our
of
best.
Millennium, it was cancelled even before they clearly had a story that they were intending to lead up to involving the actual Millennium that they didn't actually then get to do on the series. So they were like, well, let's do a Millennium episode of the X-Files.
Yeah, because of the X-Files connection, that's how I knew about it. I know many saw it back in the day, And then again, the DVDs came out after the Millennium, but it's like, it was one of those, it's like, it was just on so late at night. Like by the time 2000s rolled around, I think everyone was like afraid to play it. It was just too grim. Couldn't modify it. It was just too, just so intense. And I finally got around to it this year. I told Dan before we started, it's like, I've finally seen it. It's just a long time in the making. It's just, I never had access to it. It's just so weird because now everyone else is playing grim stuff like Criminal Minds, which is definitely influenced by this. And you're like, wow, really? And yet this show is like, is it just too good for TV?
But also, like, I know that J.J. Abrams was hugely influenced by the X-Files, and not just, he's also like a major fan of the Twilight Zone. But yeah, like, there's an X-Files book that I've got where he's written like the forewords, and he then went on, to create like Alias and Lost and stuff like that, CDs that were, super influenced by the X-Files. And he talks in the foreword about having met Chris Carter and that being a major event in his life and stuff on the plane.
Totally. Okay, I'll let you go, John. Sorry.
No. I just, sorry, I keep wanting to jump in. I apologize. I do this on our podcast too. I'm
yes.
I never stop talking. I'm so sorry. But anytime you guys are saying something, it just makes me think of another point. And when you look at some of the best shows that were on television and have been on television, there's one thing that most of them have in common, not all of them, but some of the shows we've been talking about, is that the writers don't write down for the audience. They respect the intelligence of the audience.
Yeah.
And, some of the best Star Treks of the original series, The Twilight Zone, these shows, the writing was written for, it was, they respected the intelligence of the audience, that the audience is smarter than a lot of these pablum shows give them credit for. And so that's a big thing too. There's a real hunger for smart TV shows. And so when something like this came out and it was done in an intelligent, thoughtful way, it's wonderful to see the reward of that, which was the success of the show.
1,000%. I can't think of any show that doesn't have like a segment of this material in it at some point or another. That there's almost always a sci-fi show that's going to be pretty goofy along the way, or a horror show that has just like 10 giant ingredients in it, and you're just like, yeah, and there's going to be a big giant mystery to strip away that'll make sense at the end. It is just like, even people who don't like it reference it. It's just like it's just too influential. Like Stargate SG-1 was often cited as becoming X-Files by the fourth year, and you had the other stuff on like Stephen King's The Dead Zone that was really big on USA Network, and that was kind of their answer to trying to have a lot of Millennium type of programming. And I did. Sorry, go ahead.
I think the difference with the X-Files though is it's funny. It's really witty.
Oh yeah.
And the intelligence comes out in all the different ways. The two protagonists are intellectual equals, so they're kind of back and forth repartee. It's witty, it's sharp, and it builds continually. And when they encounter things, sometimes they're scathing and kind of judgmental, and sometimes they realize that they're the ones being ridiculous, and they can laugh at themselves and each other and the world. And that philosophical kind of space that they take up, I think, is really healthy and really important. And they deal with incredibly serious issues, but sometimes in that you've got to have gallows humor. I mean,
even if it doesn't work, it kind of does. It's like, it's just bigger than the sum of its parts. And every once in a while, I'd even see people who are watching stuff like Jericho or Fringe, and I'd be like, okay, so they'd be describing it to me. I'm like, so it's like X-Files 2.0. And they're like, what do you mean? It's not anything. I'm like, oh, it is. Does Jericho feature a secret government agent who's poisoning a well? That's definitely an X-Files reference. Fringe. I mean, come on. This guy's going after aliens.
I thought of like Supernatural and Bones.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, even Howard Gordon, is like a lead writer on this for like the first few years. And then he later works on Buffy and then the, conspiracy mystery show that's 24. And it was so great watching the Millennium documentary, because they talked about how they just kind of were just kind of the show that was a keeper that no one kept around too long. And it was just so funny. They were interviewing one of the editors who worked on all the other giant procedural shows at that time, and he would often be told on the producers of Profiler, make this episode more like Millennium. Where we can't be that gritty, but we got to be a little more just like still kind of edgy, like serial killer has a flashback, or someone senses something with their. And it's just so funny because sometimes it would backfire, because then they made people think that the character on Profiler was a psychic like Frank Black, or a guest character on X-Files. Are like, nope, I didn't intend that, but I was going for a similar kind of edgy visual. So like you guys were talking about before, is just like the right people get it. It was like they would put gorgeous people in a show, but they wouldn't write them as intelligent as Scully and Mulder. And it's like, okay, so you missed the point. And it's just so funny. Everyone who really understood it, they wanted their show to be on that peak, on that level. And it's just, you just kind of had to say, okay, well, okay, you might not necessarily completely understand it, but for the most part, you do adore it. You do want to pepper it and sprinkle it with the goodness that are the highlights of the show. And well, do you think it was just too good for its own good? Because after a while, everyone, it seems like I can't go a single thread without everyone wanting to debate about the weaker season or the newer rehash of it. And I'm just like, it was time well spent for me. I don't regret any of it, even when it wasn't a great episode or great year, because like I came in on it when it was always replaying, and all the eras, like the first 9 years were replaying, and I came to even like some of the other characters like Doggett, and
I think people got very, very attached to the original, and it's like Nirvana, right? Everybody kind of goes, oh, there's the one album that's brilliant, and everything else is kind of
it broke it.
and that's the thing. It's like people get really kind of hooked into like their vision of the X-Files. It's like it was perfect when. And it's like it was always different, and it was
exactly. And it's like it's a lose-lose argument. Like when you challenge, it's kind of like when I still see shows do that. It's like people will complain about something not being different enough, and then when you do something different, they're like, oh, I want the old stuff back. I'm like, you guys are just killjoys. What's going on here?
Well, the larger the audience gets, the more opportunities you're going to have for people to start being naysayers about the show. And
I see people who hadn't even seen it before, and they saw this new show, and I was like, well, this was kind of a pat on the back for people who had grown up liking it. And I saw other people who still couldn't follow it. I'm just like, I guess the timer ran out, I guess, for this show. I enjoyed it, but I'm biased. I just kind of generally like something that's atypical and odd, and doesn't have to follow a formula. So
isn't that what happened, right? So in the first few seasons, they're finding themselves, they discover what works and what their audience wants, and then the next few seasons they give that, but there's still that initial kind of, we can do more, we want to create, we want to develop. And so after the first 5-6 seasons, they've started to now find their characters, and I'm not saying that the characters grew stale, but some of the things that happen in the later seasons become a little bit like a rehashing, or a little bit like they're in a box because
it's so
there's
tough,
no place.
You get older, you kind of want to repeat what you're doing because everyone has given you that fanfare, and then it's like, what do you do when you don't meet that fanfare?
And,
and
because it's successful, the company who's producing it doesn't want it to deviate too far from the model that's being successful.
Yeah.
So they kind of say, well, let's not move too much. Let's not grow too much. Let's stay within the confines of this box. And it eventually becomes stagnant, and there's not much more for the show to do. But they hold on for those they just eke out the last drops of commercial success.
You got 2 movies, one's successful, the other's laughed off the stage. But what I thought was so interesting is like the second movie, I would have thought many people would have liked. They absolutely hated it, even though they loved everything else. And Roger Ebert really loved the second movie because he hadn't even seen an episode of the show at all. But the themes got too through to him. He's like, oh, this is about, taking ownership of a troublesome scenario. Oh, this is about bizarre questions that not any ordinary person can answer. It's like, so that's just interesting how.
I think oh, sorry.
So I was just going to say, but to service the narrative, right? Their characters are kind of locked into a certain cycle of growth, but the audience themselves, right? They have maybe grown past the characters, because in life kind of takes them in broader directions, and so things just got a little muddled and kind of confused, and that's where they may have lost people.
No one knew how to market it after a while. It's like, okay, what are we going to do any different? It's like, and if we reveal any secrets to you, this was years before people were even doing the Christopher Nolan effect, where we don't show you much and then we draw you in with just, it's different enough. But yeah, no, that's so true. It's like, it seems like, much like with Friends, you kind of fall out of place after a while, and that's kind of seemed like this is where this franchise went. But like, I would even see people who got into the show Millennium and they weren't particularly crazy about X-Files, and it's just so weird. I'm like, wow, really? Okay, because they're sister shows.
I think as it developed, it asked a lot more of the audience as well, in terms of it asked you to grow up a bit, and it asked you to be a bit more real about society and about the world. Not everyone wants to do that. Some people just want to chase money, and that's great. But actually, it was asking you to take those leaps. And it was exploring things like Eastern mysticism. It was exploring, far more kind of complex ideologies and complex ways of viewing the world. And with that came the surrealism of like Darren Morgan's writing, until you get to the place where you've got like the encounter with the were-monster, which is just one of the funniest things ever written as far as I'm concerned. It's like...
Spoilers.
Yeah, I won't say any more, Joe.
But yeah, no, that's so true. Like,
that's all right. I'm just lost. I'm just nodding and smiling.
Because like, Dean Morgan and James Wong is like, they were interested in that, like, they're creating their own shows at the same time. They took some time off, and so then Chris Carter had is like, okay, who do I appoint as like the head directors and writers on the show at this moment? I can't do all the work. I'm in charge of all 3 shows. And so it's just interesting how it's like even Wong admitted is like, that's how he came up with the Final Destination series. Is like, these were scripts that were on producer X-Files that no one wanted on the show, and it's like, okay, then I'm going to do my own franchise and get that New Line Cinema money. And this is so funny how
you just reminded me. I've actually got like a copy of the X-Files script that they eventually turned into that movie series. It's interesting. I thought you were talking about how they were showrunners for the 2nd season of Millennium, and then like Chris Carter returned for the 3rd season.
Yeah, and then Chip Johansson comes in on season 3. See, I love kind of what they all did on Millennium, and so many of the guys are hard on themselves, like compared to the DVD commentaries they made back in the day versus the documentary now. Like Spotnitz, Frank Spotnitz was another lead writer. He later created the Man in the High Castle show for Amazon Prime, and he's like, this show pretty much mentored me. He's complimenting all the other writers in their episodes, and he's just like, oh, it felt so great bringing Frank back. Then I see him on the documentary. He's like, oh, I was so disappointed with how I brought him back. So they're just, like you guys say, is like, just like how everyone kind of grows out of themselves at a moment. Some of them are just so close to it. You just got to take it all with a grain of salt. It's like, hey, don't live life with any regrets, buddies. You guys brought us one hell of a show.
Yeah, I thought it was great that Frank Spotnitz was involved in the X-Files from like the 2nd season, but also another writer that I really loved that he worked on X-Files and stuff like that, like the Lone Gunmen also was.
Vince Gilligan of Breaking Bad fame figures out how to make his whole addicting narrative it was so funny. You look at Lone Gunmen, which, by the way, as we speak, you can still watch all the episodes on YouTube. Someone uploaded and it hasn't been taken down, but it's like you can often tell what episode Frank has written, which is more dense, intense, and conflicting. Chip Johansson, if he's written an episode, it's often more kind of nuanced and very, very mysterious. And yeah, Vince, if he's written an episode, it's often just very darkly comedic, and you're just like, huh. Okay, yeah. And so they like you say, they build their signature style that we kind of know them from. Is like, you got to be looking more intensely because it does kind of flow like a river. You got to see what are their pedestals, their main talking points.
Yeah, I thought it was cool as well. Like as you said earlier, like they did a second film, I think in 2008.
Yeah,
and
it was a big year for movies. Had a lot of competition, and it kind of came and went. And yet, I saw many people who kind of liked it, and there was many who just were like, "I don't know what that was about." It almost killed their fandom. I'm like, "For real? Okay."
It's like, come on, it's going up against The Dark Knight, which is one of the most popular films, like probably ever.
Yep.
I thought it was great that like they were able to bring quite a few writers from like the first 9 seasons back for the last 2 so far. The last 2 seasons of X-Files.
Yeah, it's like that show. It was almost kind of like with the Picard show. It's like they're complimenting the best moments of the last Star Trek movie, and then they're kind of fixing the problems other people had. So it's just a hard thing to do. Is like, how do you make everyone happy, or most people happy? And obviously the naysayers are never going to like it, and at the same time you got to still kind of like examine any flaws that everyone had an issue with. It's hard to do. And I saw many people who when they came back for those final 2 years in the 2010s, is like some of them got hooked on the second to last season, but forgot that the other season was on because there was like a year delay. So it's just like they just couldn't win. They just always were going against, by that point they're going against streaming numbers versus actual recording TV numbers. So it's just like, I think after a while it's just like everyone got so used to ripping it off. By the time it came back, everyone was like, oh, I've already seen this or that. And it's such a shame because I still think there's some kind of story in it. And at the same time, like no one wants to.
I think what's cool at the moment, though, is like I work in a secondary school in the UK, and I have students coming in going, "Have you heard of this show? It's called The X-Files because it's on Disney Plus here." So they're like tuning into it, and they're all watching it, and it's really cool. Yeah. And I said, "Oh, actually, I really love it. It's one of my kind of original, part of me type of shows."
Yeah.
And they come in every week and they've binged like another 3 or 4, and they just want to talk about it. And I think it ties in really with like the way they feel about authority at the moment. It's like you look at government, particularly here in the UK, and I have to say sometimes in the US as well, and it's not pretty. And these are not people always to be trusted and to be believed. And
even though we were talking about this for decades, now everyone's finally listening, and so now it seems even more relevant to them.
Exactly, and I think that's it. I think people are looking for truth in different ways now, and they're more inclined to go on a bit of a journey like Mulder and Scully do and pursue it, and actually find and dig deep and explore. So it's a joy kind of seeing them enjoying it, and they come to it of course without any of the whole, oh, what was it like in season whatever, or the film was this and the film was that. They don't care about any of that. They're just seeing this as a fresh thing. They don't even really realize, I don't think, when it was made, because apart from the phones, the technology is not that awful. It could have just been a bit retro looking, and 90s is cool at the moment. So it could as well be a remake, to be honest, and they love it.
It's
so
like
it's really
fashion trends, what
literally
was laughed off the stage at the end of that era.
I don't think the X-Files, the way it was created and the era in which it found initial success, I don't think you could transplant it on as a whole thing, right? Into today and have equal success. You'd have to change it significantly for 3 reasons. One, the relationship between Mulder and Scully would have to be different because there's a third wave feminism now, and it's taking on a bit of a sharper edge, right? So there's a lot more contention between the genders, even today as it's presented. Second, with disclosures around the world, and particularly in the United States recently, that unidentified aerial phenomena actually exists, then the story itself would take a different kind of spin for that conspiratorial government element. It wouldn't be about keeping things secret, the institution itself trying to keep it secret, but rather it would get into the whys of it and what is admitted to, but what is still hidden, and it would get a little bit convoluted. And the third thing is, I really do believe that today the young like the teens and the young adults, are not so interested in just kind of learning about and encouraging change in a slow, measured way. They want protest. They want aggression. They want to make their voices heard and loudly. And with, in the era of TikTok, everyone's got an opinion, and everyone who's different from them is wrong. And there's a vast gap between people in just public discourse. So I don't think it would be as successful in the current format, in the way it was initially. It would have to change significantly. And I don't know if it would be X-Files. It would be X-Files Extreme, or the X-Files, the Hidden Archives, or something that would take it to another level that might kind of taint the initial strength of that first relationship. Anyway, that's my thought about that.
Oh, totally. I mean, you can't. Every other episode would often be making fun of what was going on at the time. There's tasteless reality shows. There's even the earlier stages of the internet commented on. And it's like some people would even note they kind of.
And the humor today is different. Back then, the humor could be a little slight, a little bit, so you thought that, well, and they move on. Now it's much more attacking, much more cutting.
Everyone is in your face more and more, and it's just weird how it's like stuff that was considered just too weird at times for when it was back on is kind of even joked about more by people who've seen reruns of it, and it's just kind of like it just goes back to even just the essence of humor in its whole. It's like you just don't know what kind of reception you're going to get, because when this show was made, this was before you had Twitter, where you could instantly hear feedback from the fans. Right. It's like, you're doing a good job, or cut out this annoying character. They're just making us want to tune out. It's like they only had newspapers to go on, and they kind of found that, when they did the one, incest, home invasion episode that added a mature audience rating. And I would always see parts of it, because reruns of the show were almost always at like 2 a.m. and then at afternoon, and it's just so funny how they played on that. It's like the episode the censors don't want you to see, or when they reran it. And it's Millennium was kind of the same thing. I look at some of that, I'm like, oh man, there were some X-Files episodes that were kind of PG-15ish. It's like, oh man, there's some episodes I'm not sure how they ever aired it on TV, other than it was 10 o'clock after everyone went home.
Well, and HBO was what was popular then, right? I mean, HBO just came on, and it was the thing that was kind of drawing people away from network television.
If they weren't watching this, they're watching Tales from the Crypt rerun.
Fox, one of their selling points was that we're going to show and tell stories that they don't show and tell on ABC, CBS, and NBC. So.
Be edgy, but
they had the backing of the network to be a little bit more risque and take some chances, because the standard 3 networks were not going to do stuff like that.
Totally.
So, you reminded me, Cam, of a particular Millennium episode where I think there's 3 of them, 3 demons, and the episode completely takes the mickey out of censors of the time. I was like, how can they get away with that?
It's just very bizarre, and it worked for the story, because now when you see, it's like you would see people do that into the 2000s, and you're just like, okay, yeah, it was edgy and freaky, and kids shouldn't have been watching that, but you were, you take the shocks away, and you still saw what they did, and it's like you liked what it did for the story. That was the difference between, when someone says something offensive on TV now, or speaks out a line at an award show, now it's just like, this show was just kind of commentating on the commentators, and yes, it used the right format, which was to, use a network that was going to try and find all the edgy content it could find, and, face the music later without a care in the world. And it's like they would even kind of do inside jokes to even kind of Fox itself that kind of went over their heads. It's just like a lot of this stuff is just kind of too it was going to become kind of a pop culture darling just because it's even talking about pop culture, half the time,
Yeah.
Mulder's telling Scully about a stupid movie he saw and his adult film collection.
I saw about like the second last episode, which is like all about the Brady Bunch.
Yeah. Of all things, it is like, and Scully's schooling Mulder on historical events and everything, and he's like, I was asleep during history class, And like you guys have said, it's like it's just really hard to replicate this, and it's really hard to just explain it to people because it's like changes and personas are always just changing nonstop, and it's just really hard to just even get someone addicted to it because by the time they've heard of it, they've read editorials about what other critics deemed the best and worst of the show, and it's just you got to just kind of go in blind again. And it's so cool that you guys are doing a rewatch. That's really is the best way to do it. Is like if you're doing it for a review site or for people who want just an atypical kind of subgenre even franchise, this is kind of one of them.
And one of the things that I've enjoyed about having conversations about the episodes one at a time over the course of the season or over the course of the next several years. I mean, however we do it week by week, it's the look back at what was typical or topical at the time and kind of understand that the episode didn't occur in isolation. I mean, there were some really interesting ideas that the writers wanted to explore, and cryptids or, aliens or whatever, but there was usually something that was relevant to the era. Like the one that we just watched, Eve, that was in the era of cloning and, Dolly the sheep, and there was the Human Genome Project. So all these things are components of what the writers are using as source material, then helps us as commentators, members of the group, kind of look back and remember those pivotal social and community issues that arose, and then frame what's going on for the characters in that context, so that it reminds us of what we ourselves kind of went through in that era, as we were aware of or not aware of, but all those things were still influencing us in some way. The episode about AI, that's really relevant to today, right now, as AI is becoming more popular, and Meta is just introduced the whole this AI underpinning its entire virtual world. So these are things that almost from an anthropological perspective, we can look back and study the progression of topics that are relevant in our culture today. Not the least of which is the relationship between the genders and how first wave feminism, second wave feminism, and however you want to frame it. But it's just how and when society shifted its perspective on things, and how is it influencing the now. That's one of the things I enjoy about our conversations.
I think that's interesting what you said. I sort of view it in like a three-dimensional perspective, and like it's interesting, as you say, like viewing it through the lens of what was going on at the time. But not only that, because we are removed from time from when the episodes aired, we could look at how it relates to like modern times, the present day, and in the opposite direction, perhaps what history or what mythological roots might have sort of influenced the episode, or at least influenced the way that viewers might have interpreted the episodes. And regarding AI, like you reminded me of the show Harsh Realm that Chris Carter also
right.
created.
And they thought it was going to be a mega hit, and then they didn't get any ratings. And you're like, Are people just becoming too desensitized to this?
I think that was sort of ahead of its time in a way, because like I watched that and I was like, wow, this is like seems so influential to what then The Matrix was.
Yeah, and it goes even back to the Babylon 5 versus Deep Space Nine, argument. It's just like Deep Space Nine came on the air first. B5 had a pilot, retooled some cast members, and had been in the stages first, and they did a silent lawsuit, and then everyone kind of did the whole rivalry, and then kind of came to eventually say, hey, you can like both. There's no reason why you can't like both. And I think this is it, is like this show just predicted also just how everyone's not going to be able to predict what happens next, but everyone's so focused on being the guy who does it first to where they lose any sense of, but make sure the story's right, make sure, like people even get into, their earliest memory of, when HBO was groundbreaking in the 2000s, and they had their newer shows, is like, was it Oz or was it The Sopranos? So you get those arguments. So I think, this show is just basically just, it was a bit of everything. It still continued pretty strongly into the early 2000s. And then after a while, it's just like, everyone just wanted to talk about what they remembered versus, what they had actually seen. And it's like you say, is like, it still lives on because so many people just knew that they had to make a show that had a strong philosophy, and just the acting and character development was always strong no matter the material. But it's just bizarre how you have to still remind people to justify what they got. You never really know when a new show is announced. I always go based on the gimmick and some of the talent involved now. And it's so hard because other people they are still of the era where it's like the trailer has to grab them and you're like, I'm there, even if the, dialogue sounded bad, or, it looks like there's unfinished effect shots, I'm then. So we're still kind of that generation where we're trying to pick each other's brains and find what really gels with us. Cause I don't
necessarily resign it to the past and say it will never come back.
It already came back again. I mean, there were two computer games. There's one where basically you play as either Mulder or Scully and you get to fight zombies and everything. It's like there's so influential. It's just like the fact that Scully, the name, came from the nickname Jodie Foster receives in Silence of the Lambs. That was very telling. And I mean, again, if you've seen Criminal Minds, that is basically Millennium 2.0. Like everyone's doing a lot of the same. Whenever there's a procedural, they pretty much are winking their head to Millennium in some way, because at the time it was trying to be kind of like Lambs or even Seven, but on TV. And it's just so hard to even tell people, is like, hey, if you like this program, I think you're going to like this program. You never know how much of it is, again, like you say, people wearing out what they're interested in and the trends. Again, the show predicted everything. Just kind of just write it off is kind of just like very annoying. It's just like, yeah, but we really do dig the substance. There is a lot of substance here.
It always goes back to the writing. I mean, it's a great show, and it holds up, even if it's just from a sociological kind of inspection point of view and looking back. And Brad's right about, that's one of the things that's really fun about watching the show and then discussing it, is what was happening in the world at the time. Because that's one of the things that was wonderful about the show, is they took current events and enfolded those events into the narrative that they were telling on the show. And so it made it even more, it was topical at the time, so that grabbed people's attention. But for us, it's nostalgic and also historically interesting to go back and look at these things and see how things have changed or how they haven't changed, or things that have gotten better or gotten worse. And so it's a fascinating journey to go back and watch it, because there's still so much that you can glean from the show. That it hasn't lost the mystery of of discovery. I don't think.
Exactly. This generation stuff is inevitably going to fly over their head. They didn't have, parents who were, reading the tabloids or as much news media. And it's like, now we got such a more divided, countries. And so it's like, you're going to have, is like, if anything, like Dan's been suggesting, is like, you might want to read this with, again, a dossier or a reference book, for people who have made it their life's work to re-see episodes with the various characters and, just other story notes and background trivia. Cause it's just so hard to, again, like you say, some people are going to watch everything, but they're only going to watch it once, or they just need a reference point before they start watching it. And it's even wilder because we are in an era where now people like to rewatch various movies multiple times and find something every time. And other times everyone's pretty dead set, like, ooh, I didn't understand it. I don't want to understand it. And so,
but I think that's what the X-Files podcast can be like so great at. I think I'm not alone in saying the way that yourself watches the episode can be completely transformed, and
you can change even your take on it to where you're just like, okay, this is just as good as a DVD commentary track. I'm watching this alongside.
Yeah, so I hope that the viewers on YouTube, or we also broadcast to Facebook, take that from it, potentially, the insights that we can.
Oh yeah,
well, that's one of the things that happens on the podcast every week. Really, is that we'll all come in with our set kind of our notion or our opinion of what the episode is, and by the end of the podcast, we will have heard from so many different points of view that we can suddenly either say, hey, there really is something more interesting to that episode than I thought, or that's one of the things that's really great about the podcast, is that because we all come from disparate points of view, even though the unifying factor is that we're all watching the same show, it's great because we can all come back at the end with some sort of appreciation or new opinion on the episodes. And that's one of the things I really love about doing the podcast.
Yeah, there's people who legit are big Area 51 fans who like this show, and there's others, is like, they don't believe in aliens, and it's like, that's the other part too. It's like, okay, so again, you're Scully and Mulder. You can all get together and be the equivalent of who the characters you see on screen. And that's just it too. If there's food for thought, if you're talking about it after the fact, then you can't deny that something made some kind of impression on you. It's just very hard to explain that to some who just, they either accept or reject. And if they reject, it's very hard to tell them, it's like, well, that doesn't necessarily mean it was bad. It just means like something hit a chord, it hit a nerve with you.
There's sorry, go ahead, Annie.
Oh,
go ahead.
No, go on, Brad. It's okay.
No, please.
Okay. Oh, we're so nice, aren't we? I think, what was I going to say? I was going to say, I think when you're talking about trying to hook people in, I think if you know the person really well, then you'll be able to work out the style of writer that matches that person, because I think the styles are so distinctive. And, it doesn't have to be like from any particular season. I don't buy into, one season's better than the other. I think within every season, they're absolute gems. And there's going to be something that will really hook them. So it's like, it's kind of matching them up to that and just dropping that one in and going, they're not all like this, but they are in every single season. And you've got to watch it all to find them and like set them off a little mission. And that's certainly how I've hooked poor, innocent friends of mine who are now completely corrupted by the X-Files, which is exactly how everyone should be.
No, I was just gonna bring that up, Annie. You said that other people have been they've seen the episodes and they become hooked or become really excited and really energized about the topic or the content of the episode, right? The X-File aspect, the X-File content, and then they start developing an affinity toward the characters, right? I was going to say that I think one of the benefits of that type of experience that you're noticing with new people coming into it, or the experience that we're having right now as we're talking about it, or as we have when we have our regular podcast sessions. What's really happening is that a community of people who are sharing their thinking about something that they feel really really satisfied with, that really gives them a lot of joy. And that conversation, whether people are listening to us having the conversation or they're participating in the conversation, it's all about helping people find a little bit of balance in a crazy world. And not that they're trying to make sense of the world they're experiencing, but rather because they're engaged in the conversation or listening to the conversation, it helps them feel like they're part of a community that brings them a little bit of mental well-being, or spiritual well-being, or connectedness that I think in our challenging world right now people need more of. So whether you're passionate about the X-Files, you're passionate about Millennium, or you're passionate about Supernatural, or any of the other really successful shows, TV shows, or movie franchises, Star Trek, whatever it is, if you can find a group of people to engage with, or participate in those conversations, or
just look for the Easter eggs alone,
or just look for the Easter eggs, or just
is that the Illuminati symbol? Oh, they were really
listen to podcasts. As long as you're connecting to people in that way, that's a very positive experience. And as John was saying, I'll just echo, right? For us engaged in the conversation, when Dan approached us and we said, let's have a conversation about this stuff and see where it takes us. It's so great to see different perspectives, because everyone brings as John said, everyone brings their own kind of thought about something. And by the end, we've been enlightened, not necessarily changed our perspective on something. I'll never like the spaced episode, but I will understand. I will understand things better, right? I'll appreciate people's perspectives better because of their insights into something now I might not have keyed on from within the episode, the writing or the soundtrack or whatever it is. And that's really a positive.
That goes back to the whole point of a review, because now we see everyone, they want to say, here's my hot take.
Right,
I'm going to get some hate mail tonight. It's like, why do you want hate mail? Because everyone likes to also do the whole any attention's good attention. And I don't think that's even X-Files' intentions. They're just let's just wing it. And then let's actually, get our feet, narrowed and to the ground and be able to stand upright with our voice. And then again, like any X-File, let's either close it or it's going to remain in the cold case files.
It's just about it's about the journey. It's not about the destination, right?
Exactly. And
we shouldn't be plotting.
Many do that. They were so dissatisfied with the answer. I'm like, that episode, if you look really closely, not about the answer. It's about how they get there and whether they even grew as characters versus again, this case was going to remain unsolved. It was going to remain kind of WTF-ish, where you're just like, what happened? They don't know. We don't know.
And welcome to life, because that's exactly what life is like sometimes, right? There's no closure. At times, there's no closure. So you take what you can get and you move on. So the show really established a lot of kind of adulting before adulting became a term. Established a lot of adulting practices that were important for people to employ.
Well, I know many weren't always satisfied with the closure. I think most of us were. Thank you ever so much, all of you guys, for being on here. So what does Trust No One podcast have upcoming?
Can we remember the name of the next episode too?
Oh, just in general, what season are you on? If you can't remember the episode,
we're still very much on season 1, so we've just done episode 7, haven't we? I think so. Yeah, it's still very early days, which is exciting. And John is very much a newbie still, but is evolving weekly.
Yeah, it's great. It's great because every week it's something new and different, and you can already see seeds of development of where characters are growing. And so, every week, because we are going in order of the series. So it's fun to grow and explore each episode as it comes because we're doing it in order, and it's a crazy mystery tour, and we're all on it together, and I think we're all enjoying it.
John's the control group of our little experiment.
Okay.
He's the cigarette man pulling the strings. If he's not the Millennium group who's coming in and saying, you will no longer investigate us. We get here and have a bigger clearance than the FBI. Thank you all for hitting on the themes. Thank you ever so much for hopefully giving some perspective to this.
Well, thank you
for having us.
Multi-perspective
It's been
show.
a pleasure.
Anytime.
Follow us on the web on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The podcast is available on Podbean, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Anchor, Apple, and anywhere else podcasts are available. Feel free to review our show and leave comments on any of those sites. Thanks a million for listening.
It's a jacked up